It's Wednesday, it's 11:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me, Conservative MP Laura Trott, Labour MP Barry Gardiner, Guardian North of England editor Helen Pidd and political editor at The Sun, Harry Cole. Today, does amber mean go or stop?
The green list countries are the holiday countries.
There will be reasons why people feel they need to travel, either to visit family or indeed to visit friends.
Travelling is not for this year. Please stay in this country.
Boris Johnson faces questions about travel and the border at PMQs. That's live at noon. Local lockdowns could lead to unrest, says the leader of Bolton Council.
Yes, what's in that? My wallet.
What impact could cheaper imports have on wallets and farmers? We'll talk about the trade-offs in a trade deal with Australia. Let's start with travel. Let's show you all the Daily Mail headline there on the front page. Wish you were clear, ministers. Travel rules chaos as two ministers say holidays to amber list countries are OK. Prime Minister overrules them, then third warns all foreign trips are dangerous, as you heard in the headlines. Laura, is it stop or go with amber?
So for amber and red list countries, you're advised against travelling there.
Right, so why aren't those countries in amber in red?
Because the difference is the level of risk for those countries. So for amber countries, when you come back, you still have to quarantine, you have the testing regime, you've got 3 tests. For red, there's a higher level of risk, and therefore that is the quarantine in a hotel.
Right. Do you think there is room for interpretation when it comes to amber, just like the Highway Code, Barry? Because, as you know, if you're driving up to an amber light, I think the rules say something like, or the advice is, if you're close to crossing over the line, it changes to amber, you can decide whether to brake or whether to go on.
Well, the Highway Code actually is sequenced red, amber, green, not red, amber, green.
I knew you'd know the detail of the Highway Code.
And it then goes amber, red. And on red, amber, you're not allowed to go. You're not allowed to move. And when it's amber on its own, actually what it's saying is prepare to go, but don't go. So if you're on red, then it goes to amber.
Right.
But here, what is absolutely the case is that the ministers should have aligned the legislation with the detail, and they didn't. So there's no point in saying, well, you can go, but actually we don't want you to go. People need clarity on these things. And what we've seen is the government hasn't been clear, and it's been trying to have it both ways. It's a push me, pull you. And the same, I think, was the case, you know, when we were looking at the India. Yesterday, Matt Hancock was saying that Indian people coming into the country, back when it went not on the red list, he said, well, actually, it was about 3 times the rate that it was from Bangladesh. Actually, the rate in Bangladesh was 3.7% of those landing. India, it was 5.1. Okay. So there's no clarity and there's no grasp of fact, because that's Track and Trace's own figures for the people coming back into the country.
All right, well, Harry, I'm not going to ask you about the Highway Code specifically after that explanation. There has been confusion, clearly, on all of this. Harry, has the government now got a line?
Well, no, they appear to have about 4 different lines. I think that's the problem. They needed to hammer out exactly the difference between a holiday and emergency travel a lot earlier. The roadmap, the lifting of lockdown has actually been pretty smooth so far, and this seems to be the sort of first hiccup they've hit. I think the problem stems from the fact that, you know, lots of people want to travel to places like France and Spain and Germany, and our closest neighbours, who are still restricted to do, are still on amber. Not for a holiday, not to go and sit on a beach, but because they haven't seen their family for the better part of a year, some people, or even more, or they want to see relatives. And I think the nuance of travel has been sort of swept up a little bit into buckets and spades and towels and swimming pools, which obviously they are advising against doing that in amber countries. But There's just seems to be a bit of a missed message on, actually there are lots of people who want to go, who need to travel and want to travel for reasons that aren't holidays. So I just think that lack of clarity has been a sort of hiccup in what has been so far a relatively smooth process, unlike last year where last summer was total chaos.
Right. Well, Helen, Harry's still saying there are too many different lines from the government, which I think has been demonstrated by what people have heard. What may make it even more confusing is the EU is going to decide, it's reported later today, as to whether they will welcome British holidaymakers with, for example, those who've been double vaccinated.
Yeah, it's incredibly confusing. I mean, I know personally I'm not going to book any foreign holidays for the foreseeable. It just sounds like a massive headache. But as Harry mentioned, it's not just about holidays. It's about people who need to work abroad. It's people who need to see their families. My husband, for example, he's a geologist and he has students who should be doing field trips for their PhDs, for their master's thesis. And at the moment, they just can't plan anything. So it's really affecting their education. And I just think this is yet more ill communication from a government that can never get its story straight.
Right. Well, Laura, do you want to respond to some of the points that have been made, particularly over the fact that there are just too many different things being said by too many different ministers?
Well, I think both Harry and Helen are right in the sense that this is not just about holidays, it's about people going back to their families, and that's why unlocking travel is so important. But we have to do it in a very, very cautious way. And the Transport Secretary Grant was very, very clear at his press conference that people should not be travelling to amber and red countries unless there are absolutely essential reasons. That's changed for green list countries now, which is fantastic. So some people are able to get away, but the advice is very consistent. Amber and red, you shouldn't be travelling to unless it's for essential purposes.
Do you think you'll be able to go away abroad?
I've got 3 young children. I have no desire to get them on a plane at this stage.
Well, that's fairly clear. Now, no doubt, as I said, the Prime Minister will be asked about all the issues around travel and also, of course, the Indian variant. Boris Johnson has said there will be more data around the transmissibility in the next few days, possibly early next week, but not about whether they will be making any firm decisions about unlocking. That is still not expected until mid-June. But, Helen, we're going to just show our viewers your story in The Guardian, which is about perhaps one of the tools in the armoury if the transmissibility is found to be much higher than other variants. Return of local COVID lockdowns risks public backlash. MPs warn. Environment Secretary George Eustice said he couldn't rule out restrictions in India variant hotspots. What's your response and your readers' response to that?
Well, I think that people, particularly in Bolton and Blackburn, are extremely fearful about the sort of looming threat of local lockdowns. And health experts, politicians, business people, ordinary people, journalists, we are all united in pointing to the fact that local lockdowns don't work. Bolton has been in a local lockdown longer than pretty much everywhere apart from Leicester, and cases have never really got under control there. So I don't see why the government is contemplating doing something which there is ample evidence to prove that it doesn't work. And David Greenhalgh, who is the leader of Bolton Council, I know that he had a meeting with Matt Hancock, the Health Secretary, on Friday, and he warned Hancock that there could be civil unrest and massive damage to community cohesion if a local lockdown is brought in. And you can already pick up these things in Bolton at the moment, people blaming the Asians. And I think the fact that this variant is called the Indian variant, or has been kind of co-opted as that phrase, is very unhelpful, and it does lead to community divisions. And also the government really pushing this idea of vaccine hesitancy. It just doesn't ring quite true when they also say that in Bolton and Blackburn, it's young people who have been mostly spreading the virus, and they, of course, until very recently, haven't qualified for the vaccine at all. So it's a complicated picture, but there is united opposition to the idea of a local lockdown.
Now, we can hear you perfectly, but I should just explain to viewers that the picture keeps freezing, Helen, but don't worry, we heard everything you said, and so we will continue with it. Harry, your picture is fine. Do you accept that the government is going to face quite a bit of opposition in the way that Helen has outlined if it goes down the route of local lockdowns?
Yeah, absolutely. Excuse me. And that's exactly why they don't want to go down the route of local lockdowns, and why they're sort of kicking decisions about June 21st and lifting of social distancing and ending of masks in various places into next month. They were meant to do it at the end of this month, but they want to see the data. It's the last thing they want to avoid. Everyone remembers the great lock of the North last year, the wars with Burnham, the horse trading behind the scenes. And as Helen so rightly said, and it didn't work after all that. Neil Ferguson was out this morning saying, for a local lockdown to work, the area you'd need to lock down is massive. So I think it is the last thing they want to avoid. And that's why they keep saying, let's wait for the data, let's wait for the data. It's as much about, wanting to be able to do more lockdown lifting as much as it is about being forced to do local lockdowns. I think they just want a clearer picture and rather than rushing any decisions, because there are some elements of government I'm speaking to last night, especially, who are actually quietly confident that the data is actually going to be going the right way when it is published, hopefully sort of later on this week, over the weekend, next week. And there is there has been a big uptick in vaccine take up in some of the areas where they're really pushing it. They're flooding vaccines into those areas, and it, touch wood, it will have the desired effect. Okay. I just think that the PM has made so many rushed decisions based on sort of partial data over the last year that actually they've learned their lesson the hard way on that, and they're just going to take their time and not be forced into making a decision one way or the other until it's very obvious which way they have to go. Well,
of course, we'll wait and see over the coming weeks. I'm going to move us on, but Harry, I'm going to stick with you. Your story in The Sun, showing viewers now the headline, Cabinet beef, Tory rift over Brexit trade deal for cheap Aussie burgers and steak in British supermarkets. What are Cabinet ministers fighting over, Harry?
Well, really, you could argue that they're fighting over the intricacies of an Australian trade deal, which is actually quite minor in terms of contribution to GDP. It's been quite a quick process to get a trade deal with them. It's the first one they've done sort of from scratch. But actually, at the heart and soul of this is a bigger battle. It's the battle for Brexit. What was the point of doing all this pain over the last 5 years if we're just going to carry on trading on similar terms with other countries that we've had in the last few years? Now, Australia is almost like the sort of canary in the mine. How far are we going to go as a country in letting Australian agriculture into our system, forcing competition with our farmers? Yes. With obviously the looming bigger picture and the bigger battle that's coming with an American trade deal and a South American trade deals, countries like Brazil, where they have massive amounts of agricultural exports they want to get into our markets. So in a weird way, with Australia, we're seeing a sort of test case. We're seeing a dress rehearsal play out. The big debates that are coming over the next few years about Britain's place in the world and how we trade with our friends and allies. Right,
well, let's talk about that with Laura and Barry, because the Business Secretary, Kwasi Kwarteng, said yesterday that if the UK can't manage to do a trade deal with Australia, a liberal democracy with a shared language and shared history, then we'll struggle to do trade deals with everyone else. Do you agree that's what Brexit's about, Laura?
I think the trade deals that we've struck so far have been a fantastic success. And yes, they are a key part of what, one of the dividends of Brexit. And I think that the fact that we're close to doing this with Australia is fantastic. Very interesting, Harry's story today. But I think that we've already committed to high standards, maintaining our high standards of food quality in this country. And I think all sides agree that there is going to be some protection for farmers. I think there's some internal quibbling about the length of that, but we will sort that out, and then we'll have as Harry said, this is going to be kind of a real test case for us, and I think one that we're going to fly through, and is going to be a huge benefit to Britain.
Barry?
Trade deals are a balance between the consumer's interest, and here what the government is pressing for is cheaper beef, cheaper lamb imports into this country. But the balance that it has to be maintained is with the producer interest. And our upland farmers in particular will find it very difficult because they can't compete at the same scale as great big Australian or New Zealand prairies. So it's balancing that interest. And some people would say, well, that's just between the farmers and the consumer. Well, let's go with the consumer. But then you've got to say, well, if you don't have the upland farmers, what happens to the Lake District? The Lake District suddenly looks like a very different place. What happens to the Yorkshire Dales? What happens to the Scottish Highlands? And actually, it's not just about farming. It's not just about food and animal welfare. It's actually about our landscape. It's about our tourism industry. So then you've got to ask, well, what do we gain in return? And what I think has been extraordinary about this debate is the government hasn't said, what they're complaining about in Australia is that we're going to get this in return for accepting their cheap imports.
Laura?
we're an open free trading nation. This deal will be as much of a benefit to our farmers here as it will be to those on the other side of the trade deal. Right?
That's not what Minette Batters says as president of the NFU.
You must have very locally. I've certainly got businesses locally who are already seeing the benefits of this, right? Of exporting to new markets, of having a worldwide view rather than one which is just focused on our nearest neighbours.
Have you spoken to any fishermen lately? The fishermen are up in arms against the government because actually the trade that they were told was going to be all in their court, they would have all the fish and they'd be able to do with it what they like. They can't get it into Calais.
And I take that, but let's stick to farmers if we can.
I mean, but that is also why the government's giving more support to the fishing industry. But I think with farmers, as I said, this presents an opportunity. Of course, there will be protections. No one is arguing the fact that there won't be protections. But
so who's paying for it then, Laura? We are. The taxpayer is then going... Those subsidies to farmers, those subsidies to fishermen that you're saying, oh, there will be these protections. Who pays for that? The British taxpayer pays for it, not the Australian taxpayer. So actually we're allowing cheap imports in, which we're then going to subsidise.
No, that's not... I mean, I think Harry wants to come in, but that's not quite right in terms of it will be about getting rid of tariffs, which are not obviously subsidised by the British taxpayer.
No, you said that you're going to
there is a choice, Barry, because
that's with subsidy.
All right, I'll come back to you in just a moment. Harry, you were trying to come in.
No, I was just going to say it's astonishing to hear these arguments about where the money comes from taxpayer subsidies when suddenly it's the British government handing them out. I didn't hear Barry complaining when it was massive EU farm subsidies for British farmers.
You didn't listen then, Harry, because I was. I've always been against the subsidies.
So you've always been against the subsidies, but what about for your constituents who would like cheaper beef and lamb? Your constituents in Brent are not hill farmers in Scotland and Wales.
Absolutely right. And that's why I say it's a balance of consumer and producer interests. But what you do have to do is you have to consider the whole thing in the round, not just think, well, it's about cheap beef or expensive beef, or it's about cheap beef versus farmers. It's not. It's actually about the whole way in which we do trade. And what are we getting in return in this negotiation? We went into these negotiations saying that we wanted increased access for our services, our financial services and our other services, and also about digital. Now, actually, if we do a deal with Australia on digital services, that may prejudice the ability that we have to do digital services with the rest of the European Union.
Right.
Now, that's not something that we should be welcoming. It will cut off a huge source of trade.
Let me bring Helen in at this point. You wanted to say something, Helen.
Yeah, I mean, there's the elephant in the room here, right? What is this government, which is supposedly committed to a carbon-free future, doing promoting shipping meat, which we all know is environmentally fairly disastrous, 9,000, 10,000 miles around the world, while betraying our own farmers? I just don't think that they can have it both ways. And also, if you look at the way sort of eating trends are moving in this country, it's about what people want is they want to know where their food comes, and they want it to come from local farms. So I think it's outrageous that the government is pursuing this and also painting itself as a clean green government. You can't have it both ways.
Well, Laura, do you want to respond to that?
Well, we've got incredibly ambitious environmental targets which we're going to achieve without cutting ourselves off from the rest of the world.
Right, but is that going to be enough to justify the sort of trade deal that has been outlined with the reservations from both Barry and Helen, Laura?
What do you mean in terms of the...
Well, in terms of the amount of free trade that we're going to get, in terms of the balance of trade that we will have that will benefit our economy.
But we won't sign trade deals that won't be a benefit to our economy.
But will they be big enough in terms of the amount that's going to be benefiting the economy?
Well, absolutely. I mean, this is a benefits to our business, benefits to consumers in terms of lower prices and more choice. I mean, this is something which, this is what part of what being an open, free trading economy is all about.
Right, but if you look at the figures, it's going to be boosting GDP from something like 0.01% to 0.03%. As I say, is that going to be big enough?
I will take any boost, Jo.
You'll take any boost. Barry?
Look, I want to do a trade deal with Australia, don't get me wrong.
You do?
Okay, of course. We're now in a situation, because we've left the European Union, where we have to make up the shortfall of trade that we have with the European Union.
Right.
So I want trade deals, but I want them that are going to be ultimately in our best interest.
But do you want to have your beef and eat it in this case?
And that's exactly right, what I do want to do, Jo, because what I want is I want to have quotas at different tariffs. And I think that's what we should be doing. We should say, yes, in return for us getting an advantage on services or in other areas, yes, let's open up a little bit, but we'll have quotas there and there'll be tariffs above that quota. Now, that is a graded free trade deal, which would give some consumer benefit, but ultimately would it be of overall benefit to the economy. What is being proposed is it's a principle. We believe in free trade, so we'll open up, fling the barriers and fling the gates open, come what may. And it's the come what may that they're not thinking long and hard enough about, because it will affect our farmers and it will affect our tourism industry.
Harry?
Someone once said that Brexit isn't a destination, it's a process. And welcome to the next 10 years of British politics, arguing about big ideals and free markets and tariffs and trade. It's only going to get, we're only going to be doing this more and more. This is just the first, the first opening skirmish of a much bigger ideological battle, and one that's, I think, going to dominate for many years to come.
Right, Laura, did you want to say something?
All I was going to say is that no one is suggesting flinging open with no protection for farmers. That's not been on the table at all. I think what is being debated is the length of that protection, which is rightly so. But this is going to be a gradual managed process that's going to be in everyone's benefit.
Right, your colleague, Barry, Labour MP Yvette Cooper, said at the weekend that Labour needs to start talking about the benefits of Brexit and set out a positive vision of what Labour wants to do with Brexit. Do you agree with her?
Yes, I do. Yes.
You do. And what would that look like? What are the benefits of Brexit for you?
And that's why I said very clearly that actually I want a trade deal with Australia. I want a trade deal all around the world. And actually, incidentally, it's really important, the timing of this trade deal, because, of course, we've applied to join the Trans-Pacific trade deal, and Australia can veto that. So it was perhaps not sequenced well that we tried to get this deal with Australia done, because they now have a real leverage over us, because they could veto our access to the other trade deal. So I think it's about looking outwards into the world and saying, where can we make up the shortfall in trade that we've got? We've got to be open and we've got to be positive about doing that, but we mustn't be blasé. And at the moment, I think the government is so desperate to get deals that they're not securing the ones that are going to be in our best interest long term.
All right. If anyone... do you want to respond, Helen, before we move on?
No.
Fair enough. That's fine. We're going to move on and talk about the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill, or a specific part of it, I should say. It's going through Parliament at the moment. It's already proved to be controversial, and we've discussed many bits of it. Today, we're going to talk about a part of the bill that is also attracting some controversy and criticism, and the fact that the police will be given new powers to deal with trespass and unauthorised encampments, and this particularly affects those in the traveller community. Now, we can be joined, I think, by Jake Bowers, a Romani gypsy and activist from Drive to Survive, a campaign coordinating peaceful protest against the bill, and a former Labour Party member. Welcome to you, Jake. Later today, you'll be outlining your concerns about the bill to a committee of MPs and peers. Why do you want the government to look again at what it's proposing?
We don't just want to look at it again, we want to get rid of part 4 of the bill, because it does some horrific things to our culture. Let me just outline some of those for you. It will entirely eradicate nomadic life for gypsies and travellers in Britain. It will give police the power to seize gypsy and traveller homes. It will fine gypsies and travellers who are nomadic up to £2,500. And if that wasn't bad enough, it will give the government the power to imprison those needing to follow a nomadic way of life through no fault of their own, because there's a lack of sites in this country. It is a cultural cleansing of the British landscape, which will be thoroughly resisted by the gypsy and traveller community. And what the Tory party is doing is they're creating a coalition of the great unwashed, in their view. And there are thousands of us, hundreds of thousands of us. In the 500 years we've been in this country, Henry VIII tried to hang us. Henry VIII tried to hang us because of who we are. Other people tried to deport us. The Tory party have hated us for years. And this is them attempting to drive the final nail into the coffin of our heritage and our culture.
All right, well, there's a lot to unpack. And I just want to say to viewers, yes, the picture is sort of coming in and out, but we can hear every word you say. Obviously, is the thing of today's programme, Jake. Now, the government says there is an appetite to extend powers available to the police, particularly from local authorities. Do you accept, Jake, that there are some encampments that have not been popular with people who live near them?
I accept that there's a conflict, and I also accept that there needs to be a resolution. Let me just quote somebody who spoke to Parliament yesterday. This is Martin Hewitt, chair of the National Police Chiefs Council, so not a gypsy. He said very, very clearly, there is the fundamental problem is that there is an insufficient provision of sites for gypsies and travellers to occupy. That we agree with. 85% of police forces that respond to the government's own consultation on this said they didn't need more powers. The powers, Joe, are already really strong. I was with a family just last week that were evicted 3 times in one day, that were convoyed and chased out of Sussex by Sussex police to Kent, like some bizarre scene out of the Duke of Hazzards. It's ridiculous, the powers that are there already. They're already too strong. But people who live on the road and who are nomadic, they would rather experience constant eviction, the constant cycle of eviction and harassment, and be split up into social housing where they would be isolated from their wider family. The thing that strikes me about all of this is, my dad was a massive fan of Margaret Thatcher. The Tory party are dumping on some of the weakest people in our society. But those people, in many cases, are great fans of the Tory party. We're independent. We're often run small businesses. We want nothing more than to be left alone.
All right.
And the Tory party is throwing, this is red meat to the Tory party. It's performative prejudice.
All right. Well,
towards the most in our community.
All right, you've made that very clear. There are lots of things to talk about. Just stay with us. Can you just address that final remark about the Tory party and red meat, cultural cleansing? I mean, it's a pretty damning indictment of the view from Jake.
I disagree with Jake in the strongest possible terms. I think it's very important to be very clear about what this bill does and doesn't do. This is not about authorised traveller camps. That's not about that at all. It is about unauthorised sites, which are already a civil offence. This is about making them a criminal offence, which means that police can be involved. Now, I have seen locally the impact that this can have on local communities, and it is, as Jake pointed out, about fairness in the sense of it is not fair that my parish council had to spend £10,000 evicting an unauthorised traveller site next to a playground. It is not fair that my community had to deal with the distress and upset and disruption which that brought, and the cleaning up bill afterwards. The fact that the head of my parish council, a woman, had to go and deal with this personally with no help from the police. That is not fair, and that is what this is going to deal with. It is not about. It's absolutely not about in any way affecting authorised traveller camps.
Jake?
Listen, I agree. I agree that there's a conflict, but one of the things that Laura is very, very quickly glossing over is the fact that there is a national shortage of places for people to be. That situation where people are forced into conflict with each other is the exact making of the government, which has not provided enough places for people to live. If you want to change a situation, you provide a carrot as well as a stick. The police don't take a stick. They want places for people to be, and that's what everybody has been...
Well, let me let Laura respond on that. I mean, if there were more sites, then we wouldn't have this problem, Laura.
I'm glad that... And I agree in terms of the fact that we must have proper sites available. Certainly where I am locally, there are 3 authorised sites. They were not used by these individuals, and we do need strong powers to be able to deal with them. So that's certainly not the case where I am at all.
Right, can I just show you this? Jake, I'll read it out to you, but Laura, you can probably see it too. This is in The Independent. The headline, "Police do not want discriminatory new laws to criminalise travellers," senior officer says. So this is the police response to what is being proposed. What's your response to that?
I would go back to what I said earlier, Jo. This is about the fact that this is already a civil offence, but it is causing immense distress. You're leaving it to councils to be able to deal with this. People are unqualified and then who don't then have the police support to be able to evict the travellers for trespassing on people's land. And that is what these powers are all about. They are in no way intended to discriminate towards people or intended to affect authorised camps.
Right. Do you have sympathy with what Laura is saying, Barry? Do you have illegal encampments? Is it a problem in Brent?
I think Jake has spoken very powerfully. And I think this problem of the restriction of a nomadic way of life, and that's how he couched what he was saying, and I thought presented the case very well, it is something that, of course, has come about because of the increasing lack of common land available as it was over a century and so ago. And that means that travellers are being constrained. Now, I think what you've got to imagine is if we were talking about nomads on the steppes of Asia being corralled by the government of China, would we consider that these criminalisations were an appropriate response? I don't think we would. I think we would see it as discriminatory. I think we would see it as an abuse of human rights. I entirely agree with Laura that we need to have I think with Jake rather, that we need to have much greater provision of authorised camps. But I don't think we should be setting about criminalising a group of people because that is their way of life, to be nomadic. That's their choice, and in a free society, it should remain their choice.
Harry, it was part of the Conservative Party manifesto. Listening to this discussion, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I was going to make that point myself, which is this suggestion that this is somehow, just some sort of niche interest of the Home Office or, evil Tory MPs who want to do it. This was a Tory manifesto commitment, and the Tories won an 80-seat majority on the back of it. And I think you'll be hard to find anyone who would not understand the idea of having someone who is illegally trespassing and living on your land without your permission and have been asked to move on but are powerless to move them on. It is an unfair scenario. And I'm going to kick back a little bit on this idea that also that there's no appetite. There's no appetite for further increasing powers. It may not be the top of the police's priority, but local councils and town halls are calling for this. And something has to be done. And it's obviously going to be an incredibly sensitive and tough debate to have. But I suspect it's probably one that could also be had with a little bit of dialing down on the rhetoric. People go into politics to do things, to represent their constituents and change the laws without wanting to, socially cleanse and exterminate people. I just think it's really unhelpful to be having that sort of level of mudslinging.
Right, Jake, do you accept that point about the rhetoric?
Listen, I won't be taking any lessons from The Sun on how to communicate about my community. It had a campaign called Stamp on the Camps. It has deliberately, over the course of many years, whipped up racial hatred against the Gypsy and Traveller community. And, to be given lessons on languages and rhetoric by a Murdoch rag that is guilty of that really sticks in my throat. This is about the cultural cleansing of the British landscape, and it will be resisted. The Tory party might want to get rid of us, but we're going to be here. We're going to be here for a long time. We're starting a campaign called Drive to Survive. Look it up, drive2survive.org.uk. We'll be linking up with people from Black Lives Matter, people from Extinction Rebellions. The whole situation that we're in at the moment, because of COVID and lots of political situations, is we live in a pressure cooker. And the lid is going to come off this summer. And we'll see how much power there is in the Gypsy and Traveller community.
I'm going to bring Helen in just a moment. But Harry, do you want to respond to the fact
No, not really. There's only one person slinging mud here, and it's not me.
Well, except you cited examples, of course, of campaigns in the Sun.
Camps. Look it up. Look it up, Harry. That's who you're working for. You're digging dirt. You are.
All right, Jake. Well, let him respond, Harry. Although you said you don't want to, but are you sure you don't want to?
I'll let the viewers decide on this one.
All right, Helen. What's your view?
They've heard what we've said.
Well, I do think that Gypsies and Travellers are a hugely marginalised community. There was an unauthorised camp near me in Stockport recently, and the kind of bile and racism and prejudice that was being bantered about on the local Facebook group was really quite horrifying. However, there was a horrendous mess left at the end, and I can see why local people don't like that. But as Jake said, there seems to be a fairly obvious solution. Provide more authorised legal sites where people can stay temporarily with proper waste disposal facilities, places for people to put their rubbish, toilets, etc. And that seems to be the solution. And I haven't heard from Laura anything to suggest that the government is going to do anything on that side of the argument, and they just seem to be going in heavy-handed on the stick side of the carrot and the stick.
Laura?
I think when we got into the detail with Jake, he accepted that there needs to be some kind of compromise on this and further action taken on the illegal sites, right? And I think we need to do this and as Harry says, dial down the rhetoric a little bit, because if we can all agree that something needs to be done around that, and then there is a question as to whether there is sufficient provision of authorised camps. As I say, locally, that is certainly the case. So I cannot speak for more widely, but we've had a lot of illegal sites despite the adequate provision of authorised camps.
Jake, thank you very much for... Sorry, Helen?
I was just saying there isn't adequate provision.
No, I'm saying Helen, locally, where I am.
There isn't.
All right.
Laura, can I just ask, please?
Yes,
can I just ask Laura, where are your plans then? Laura, can I ask them, where are your plans for the provision of more sites because they're non-existent.
No, but I'm just so the point I was making, Jake, is that locally where I am, there is adequate provision of sites, but there we have also had issues with illegal camps. So and you have accepted the fact in the course of this discussion that something does need to be done. So I just think it's important that we can have a further discussion about whether more things are needed. But it is, you know, some of the language you're using in terms of cultural cleansing of British landscape is just, I don't think, fair or right or appropriate in when you've accepted the need for some of the things that we're actually doing, albeit that you'd like more camps as well.
Jake, we do need to move on because we've got other stuff to talk about. Hang on, Jake, we do need to move on, but I want to give you the final word, just briefly.
We are going nowhere. We've been here for 500 years. The British state has tried to get rid of us through hanging and all kinds of laws over the years. We will still be here in another 500 years.
All right.
There will be tension along the way. And the responsible politicians, like Barry, see that the state has a duty to resolve this issue, not just make it worse.
All right, Jake, thank you very much. And as we said, I think you're going to be giving some sort of evidence this afternoon to MPs and peers about this. Now, talking of policing, there have been protests in some cities, which I'm sure you've seen, about what's happening in Israel and Gaza. Now, there was a march on Saturday at the weekend in central London, and the police were there, as usual, to maintain public order and ensure marchers' safety. I'm going to show you a clip of a video that was taken. It's been circulating on social media. Here it is. An officer filmed here at this Free Palestine protest at the Israeli embassy.
Right. Free Palestine!
Now, as a result of that, there have been complaints about whether that officer breached rules on independence and impartiality of police officers in the line of duty. There is now an investigation that is going on about this. Barry, the Met say they expect officers to engage, but they must remain impartial. Does shouting Free Palestine step over the line, in your view?
Look, whatever I feel about the, however supportive I might be of one particular police officer saying something, I have to recognise that if it were a right-wing fascist march and a police officer was trying to, say something in sympathy with that crowd, that would be the corollary. I would have to accept both. So, of course, I don't accept that it's right that police officers in duty, in their uniform, should be making clearly, overtly political slogans and statements. That's not right. They're entitled, as any other citizen, to their own views, but qua police officer, they must be seen to be impartial. If they're not, then all the trust that we have in the police will break down. I would be deeply, deeply disturbed if I saw a police officer shouting out, something that was anti-Semitic or something that was racist, some sort of fascist slogan. We can't allow that to happen. It's not right. And just because you might sympathise with one saying, you have to recognise that that would open up the floodgates to everything else.
I mean, it isn't always clear, is it, Laura? Because there have been occasions where the police have shown their support for what they might call social justice causes, which are also political. So taking the knee, for example, at a Black Lives Matter march, or posing for pictures at Pride. How do you draw the line?
Well, look, the police have got a very difficult job, but Barry's right. It's right that this is looked into. They have to be impartial. It's really important, and I think, whilst we don't know what's happened in this particular case, I think it's important that it is looked into where they are engaging on one side or the other. Right,
Helen, do you think it's right this officer is being investigated?
Yeah, I do, actually. I don't think that police officers should be overtly political, and I think it's much better for them, just like BBC journalists, to stay neutral.
Harry?
I don't know what on earth is going on at the Met this year, the last couple of years. They seem to hurtle from being ultra woke, taking the knee, dancing on TikTok, to all of a sudden, kicking women's heads in at a protest about female safety. There's something deeply wrong at the heart of the Met, and I think it's approaching the territory of a new broom needs to come in and sort that place out.
Barry, do you agree?
No, I think that's going too far. But I do think this issue needs to be resolved. I think when you're looking at the policing of the protests, that Harry's just alluded to, that was a dreadful scene, and women have the right in this country to feel that they are going to be protected by the police, and that demonstration should have been policed appropriately with social distancing by prior arrangement with the Met and with the Home Office.
All right, in a few minutes' time, we will have Prime Minister's questions at midday. It's the first PMQs, actually, since the elections. And also, there was a Parliamentary Labour Party meeting, no doubt, to discuss the fallout from the elections in part, which, of course, Barry was part of. And not only was Barry there, as you would expect, but he sent out this warning to his fellow comrades, focus comrades. He said, it's the Tories we need to be attacking, not each other. Barry, you were trying to warn ahead of time Labour MPs, the tradition of briefing out from those meetings, which are supposed to be private and confidential. They didn't listen to you, though, did they?
Look, Jo, you're right. There was briefing. I don't know where.
We'd be disappointed if there wasn't.
Well, you guys would, of course. Look, my point's a very simple one. We need to unite around strong policies about what this government's doing wrong. Remember who actually we think is responsible for the problems of this society. You know, on fire safety, we have the terrible situation where they've just put through that bill, no help for leaseholders, no help for people who have got fire safety defects in their homes. The failure to help families with loved ones in social care. You know, allowing people to get fired and then rehired, sacked, and then told the next day, you can have your job back, but you'll have a lower wage. All of these things are the things that the Labour Party must focus on. They're the areas where this government has got it badly wrong, and we need to be out there fighting them. And quite honestly, who's up, who's down in the Labour Party? Nobody gives a fig about it out there. Let's get on.
Is that right?
We stand under a banner that says unity is strength. Let's believe it. Let's go out there and fight this lot.
It sounds a bit of a lonely campaign just at the moment. Does no one give a fig, Harry?
I think Barry there lecturing about hiring and refiring might want to have a word with Angela Rayner. She didn't do too badly out of getting sacked on a Saturday night and getting 4 jobs on the Monday.
I said you shouldn't fire and rehire on lower conditions, not higher conditions, Harry.
No, look, I mean, Barry's obviously trying to make our jobs harder with his memo urging people not to leak, but I think that's an uphill battle even bigger than the one facing Keir Starmer, I'd say.
Yes, it is an uphill battle, isn't it, Helen? I mean, somebody did clearly brief the criticism from Labour MPs, Kim Johnson, Nadia Whittam and Liam Byrne, about everything they had to say about what went wrong in those elections.
Yeah, I just don't know why the Labour Party can't sort itself out and focus on the glimmers of light which came from the election results. Why aren't they looking at why Andy Burnham won a 67% majority? Yeah. Why aren't they looking at how Steve Rotherham in Liverpool City region managed to sort of rise above the quagmire in local Liverpool politics to be re-elected as well on first preference votes? Why not look at why Labour is popular in these northern cities and learn some lessons from it? That's what I think they should be focusing on.
Batley and Spen, of course. That's the next by-election, obviously coming up as a result of Tracy Brabin becoming the mayor for West Yorkshire. How important is that going to be, Barry, for Keir Starmer? We had Richard Bergen, your colleague, on, another Labour MP, saying politics will take its natural course if Labour doesn't win Batley and Spen. Do you agree?
Oh, look, this isn't about the Labour Party. This is about the policies we need to actually sort out the mess that people are suffering from in Batley and Spen. You know, look at what's happening with their kids' education and the cuts to funding. Look at what's happening, you know, with their housing situation. Let's make sure these are front and foremost, you know, when we go into that by-election, because that's where the government is letting people down, and that's why we need to get rid of them.
Batley and Spen will be a massive challenge for the Conservatives, of course, won't it, Laura?
Well, I think where I would agree with Barry is that Labour has spent the past year playing party politics, and I think the electorate are partly fed up of that, as we saw in the recent election results. I think that obviously it's going to be a very tough contest in Batley and Spen, but one we will fight.
Barry?
It will be a tough contest because actually the Conservative vote was split between Conservatives and UKIP at the last election, as it was in Hartlepool. But I'm confident because Tracy was such a fantastic local MP, as has been seen by her now becoming the West Yorkshire mayor with the support of that constituency. I'm confident that we will win. And then when we are, we'll have a Labour MP there, like Tracy, fighting for local people.
Right, let's just have a look at this tweet from Henry Zeffman in The Times. Helen, do you think this is a good idea? Keir Starmer, Labour leader, is in talks with a production company about a fly-on-the-wall documentary tracking his leadership. Some aides see it as a way of getting a broader section of the public to engage with him. Is that what you'd be advising, Helen?
Well, no. I would advise him to do the exact opposite.
What's the exact opposite?
Can you think of any example of a fly-on-the-wall documentary where the subjects have come out smelling of roses with a better reputation? It's a total trap. Remember the Corbyn documentary that came out? No, I would advise him to steer well clear of it.
Harry, can these things sometimes be transformative for leadership?
A tiny bit. I mean, I'm old enough to remember Webb Cameron back in the day, where he posed awkwardly, looking like he's cleaning the dishes for the first time in his entire life, while someone held a wonky iPhone video of it. Yeah, no, I think they're rightly getting away from this very fast now.
It's time for Prime Minister's questions. Thank you all.
Last week, an inquest found Francis Quinn, Father Hugh Mullen, Noel Phillips, Joan Connolly, Daniel Teggett, Joseph Murphy, Edward Doherty, John Laverty, Joseph Corr, and John McCurr, who were killed in Ballymurphy in August 1971, entirely innocent. On behalf of successive governments and to put on the record in this House, I would like to say sorry to their families for how the investigations were handled and for the pain they've endured since their campaign began almost 5 decades ago. No apology, Mr. Speaker, can lessen their lasting pain. I hope they may take some comfort in the answers they have secured and in knowing that this has renewed the government's determination to ensure in future that other families can find answers with less distress and delay. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Good. Mr. Speaker, I strongly associate myself with the earlier part of the comments that the Prime Minister made. Can I raise something slightly different, though? It's nearly 4 years since the Grenfell Tower tragedy claimed some 72 lives, yet hundreds of thousands of families still live in unsafe, unsellable homes, and many leaseholders face crippling debts through no fault of their own. Trident Point, Pearmain House, Amber Court, all in my constituency. Given this was the biggest building scandal in modern UK history, why did the Prime Minister order his MPs to vote down our efforts yesterday to get this scandal sorted once and for all? Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I in no way underestimate the suffering of those who, the victims of Grenfell, and also those whose buildings, whose homes have been prejudiced by the spectre of unsafe materials. And that's why we provided an unprecedented £5 billion of investment. And I can tell him also that the most dangerous cladding is already gone or is going from all high-rise buildings. And we certainly agree that leaseholders should be protected from remediation costs, and people in high-rise buildings will pay nothing to replace their unsafe cladding.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister will understand that Havering, just like Hillingdon, is located on the outskirts of London and has very different needs and aspirations from those in the core area of the city. My borough still prides itself as part of Essex, and I know that his does as part of historic Middlesex. And whilst we need cooperation on things like transport, will he accept that it is time for wholesale reform of the way London and the wider region are governed, and support my campaign to allow boroughs like Havering to take back control from the Mayor and City Hall interference, allowing Havering and indeed all outer London boroughs the freedom to make their own decisions that best meet the needs of local people?
Well, I can understand the feelings of frustration that the people of Havering may feel about a current Mayor of London who does not understand the needs of Outer London, who has not invested in Outer London in the way that a previous Mayor did, who I seem to recall set up the Outer London Fund and drove through many other benefits for the outer boroughs. But I must tell him in all candour that what we need to do is work together to ensure that the glad day returns when we have a Mayor who truly represents all Londoners, Mr. Speaker.
Now comes the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome the Prime Minister's comments on the Ballymurphy inquest and the sentiment behind them? Does the Prime Minister agree that the single biggest threat to hitting the June 21st date for unlocking is the risk of new variants coming into the UK?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I certainly think that that is one of the issues that we must face, but perhaps it would be for the benefit of the House if I update the House on where we are, because we've looked at the data again this morning, and I can tell them, the House, Mr. Speaker, that we have increasing confidence that vaccines are effective against all variants, including the Indian variant, to his point. And I want particularly in this context to thank the people of Bolton, of Blackburn, many other places who've been coming forward in record numbers, Mr. Speaker, to get vaccinated, to get their first jabs and their second jabs, Mr. Speaker. I think the numbers have doubled in Bolton alone, and I think the people of this country can be proud of their participation.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, I think that's a yes, that the risk of other variants coming through our borders is one of the biggest threats to unlocking. We're not just talking about the Indian variant, we're talking about future variants. In those circumstances, why on Monday did the Prime Minister choose to weaken travel restrictions by moving 170 countries or territories to the amber list?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we have one of the strongest border regimes anywhere in the world. There are currently 43 countries on the red list, Mr. Speaker. But if you're coming from an amber list country, everybody should know that if you travel to an amber list country for any emergency or any extreme reason that you have for doing so, when you come back, Mr. Speaker, you not only have to pay for all the tests, but when you come back, you have to self-isolate for 10 days. We are invigilating it, and people who fail to obey the quarantine can face fines, Mr. Speaker, of up to £10,000.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, I think everybody would agree that having moved 170 countries to the amber list, absolute clarity is needed about the circumstance in which people can travel to an amber country. Yesterday morning, the Environment Secretary said people could fly to amber list countries if they wanted to visit family or friends. By the afternoon, a government health minister said nobody should travel outside Britain this year, and travelling is dangerous. The Prime Minister said that travel to amber countries should only be where it's essential. By the evening, the Welsh Secretary suggested some people might think a holiday is essential. The government's lost control of the messaging. So can the Prime Minister answer a really simple question that goes to the heart of this? If he doesn't want people to travel to amber list countries, if that's his position, he doesn't want them to travel to amber list countries, why has he made it easier for them to do so?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think that after more than a year of this, I think that the Honourable Gentleman would understand that what the public would like to see is some effort to back up what the government is saying, to deliver clarity of messages. And on his point about legal bans, as he knows, we're trying to move away from endlessly legislating for everything and to rely on guidance and asking people to do the right thing. And it is very, very clear, Mr. Speaker, you should not be going to an amber list country except for some extreme circumstance, such as the serious illness of a family member. You should not be going to an amber list country on holiday, Mr. Speaker. I can imagine he wants to take a holiday, but you should not be going to an amber list country on holiday, Mr. Speaker. And if you do go to an amber list country, then, as I say, we will enforce the 10-day quarantine period, and if you break the rules, you face very substantial fines.
Keir Starmer.
Speaker, that completely swerves the question. The point was, if it's only in extreme circumstances, the Prime Minister's word, why make it easier to go? If it's extreme circumstances, why make it easier to go? And, Mr. Speaker, let's test it by looking at the consequences. Since the government loosened travel restrictions, 150 flights a day are going to amber list countries. And travel agents are reporting surges in holiday bookings to those countries. Prime Minister, this isn't just a coincidence. It's because of the messaging. So can the Prime Minister tell the House how many people are now travelling to and from Britain from amber list countries every day?
Prime Minister.
What I can tell the House, Mr. Speaker, is that there has been a 95% reduction in travel of any kind to and from this country, and that is exactly what you would expect in the circumstances of this pandemic. There are 43 countries on the red list, and if you come back from one of those countries, you have to go immediately into hotel quarantine. And the reason that we're able to move forward in the way that we have is because, as I have told the House repeatedly, we are continuing with the fastest vaccination rollout, I think, just about anywhere in Europe. And as of today, 70%, Mr. Speaker, of the adults in this country have been vaccinated. And I think that is a fantastic achievement, and that is enabling us to make the progress that we are.
That's an I don't know. And the suggestion that in the last few days there's been a 95% drop-off in travel to amber list countries, Prime Minister, I don't think holds water. And I'm trying to understand the logic of the government's position. We know that new variants are the single biggest risk to unlocking. We know that the government doesn't think people should travel to amber list countries, save in extreme circumstances. But the government's made it easier to do so. The messaging is confused and contradictory, and as a result, Prime Minister, this week, many people are now travelling to amber list countries, but the government can't say how many or when. Mr. Speaker, we're an island nation. We have the power to stop this. Why doesn't the Prime Minister drop this hopeless system, get control of our borders, and introduce a proper system that can protect against the threat of future variants of the virus?
Prime Minister.
Actually, Mr. Speaker, I think what would be helpful, I've set out the position about amber list countries, I think, very clearly, at least twice. Wouldn't it be great, Mr. Speaker, to hear the right honourable gentleman to back it up for a change, using what authority he possesses to convey the message to the rest of the country? Actually, Mr. Speaker, when you look at the Labour position on borders, it's hopelessly confused. Last night, I think the Shadow Home Secretary said that they wanted to cut this country off from the rest of the world, Mr. Speaker. Pause all travel, even though 75% of our medicines and 50% of our food actually come from abroad, Mr. Speaker. And it was only recently that he was saying that quarantine was a blunt instrument and he'd rather see alternatives.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister's just wrong again. We've called for a blanket hotel quarantine for months. I raised it here 3 times at Prime Minister's questions. The government ignored it every time, and look where we are now, talking about the Indian variant. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister's former adviser had this one right. He said the government's border policy was a joke. Our borders have been wide out open pretty well throughout the pandemic. There was no hotel quarantine system in place until February this year, for that's not true. Flights are still coming in from India, and even as the variant is spreading, the Prime Minister decides now is the time to weaken the system even more. It's ridiculous. Finally, Mr. Speaker, I want to raise the appalling rise in anti-Semitism in the last week, and the attacks and the violence we've seen. On Saturday, a rabbi in Chigwell was hospitalised after being attacked outside his synagogue. Many of us will have seen the appalling incident in Golders Green, and the Community Security Trust report a 500% rise in anti-Semitic incidents since the outbreak of violence in Gaza and Israel. Now, I know the government is working on this, and both the Prime Minister and I have condemned these anti-Semitic attacks and violence. But we will all know across this House that Jewish communities remain very anxious. So what more does the Prime Minister think can be done to provide the extra support and protection needed to reassure Jewish communities at this really very difficult time?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I share his horror at the outbreak of anti-Semitic incidents, and the government has conveyed that message loud and clear to those who are responsible for enforcing the law against hate crime of that kind. But obviously we will continue to work and to support the Jewish community in any way that we can, particularly working with the Community Safety Trust, who do an absolutely outstanding job in my view, but also showing as a country and as a society that we will call this out at every stage, Mr. Speaker. We will not let it take root. We will not allow it to grow and fester. And in welcoming his remarks, I may say I think it's one of the most important changes of attitude, or U-turns, I should say, that I've seen from the Labour Party in recent times. And I'm delighted. I'm delighted that he's taking that attitude. I'm delighted that he's taking that attitude now. But I think what this country wants to see, Mr. Speaker, is a government that gets on with delivering on the people's priorities, making everybody safe. And it might have been a good thing, Mr. Speaker, if he had voted and he's got his party to vote for tougher sentences against serious and violent sexual offenders, to say nothing of people who commit hate crime.
I think, in fairness, this House is very united and will remain united. And, of course, we do support the CST. Let's come to Mary Robinson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My second AstraZeneca jab reinforced my confidence, not only in normal life resuming, but also in the future of our life science industry. In Cheadle and across South Manchester and the Cheshire Life Science Corridor, investment in R&D and innovation will bring high-skilled, well-paid jobs. Will the Prime Minister join me in recognising and endorsing the work of our northern universities, NHS trusts and life science sector, who, together with the Northern Health Science Alliance, are piloting health tech initiatives which will take us forward from jabs to jobs?
Yes. Prime Minister.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my honourable friend, who is a great advocate for the people of Cheadle, and as part of our plan to move from jabs to jobs, I'm delighted to say that over £1 billion worth of government-funded science and innovation projects are currently taking place across the North West, thanks largely, or at least in part, to her advocacy.
Let's go to the Leader of the SNP, Ian Blackford. Ian.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank the Prime Minister for his comments on the Ballymurphy inquest. Mr. Speaker, as a member of Scotland's crofting community, I understand just how disastrous a Brexit trade deal with Australia, as proposed by this Tory government, be for Scotland's farming and crofting sectors. If reports of this Tory deal are true, farmers will lose their livelihoods, rural businesses will collapse, and ultimately families will be driven off the land. And let's be very clear, if that happens, this UK Tory government will be solely responsible. So just for once, Prime Minister, give a straight answer to these farming and crofting families who are living with this threat. Can the Prime Minister categorically rule out that his government is prepared to sign up to a trade deal that will at any future point guarantee tariff-free access to Australian lamb and beef? Yes or no?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I know that the Right Honourable, but I'm delighted to see the shots of his croft, by the way, the humble representative of the crofting community. May I say that I don't think that he does justice to crofters, to farmers across the country and in Scotland as well, Mr. Speaker, because I think he grossly underestimates their ability to do great things with our free trade deals, to export Scottish beef around the world, Mr. Speaker. Why doesn't he believe in what the people of Scotland can do, Mr. Speaker? Why is he so frightened of free trade? I think there's a massive opportunity for Scotland and for the whole of the UK, and he should seize it and be proud of it.
Going back to Ian Blackford. Ian.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That was quite chilling. To try and treat something as serious as this in the way that the government and the Prime Minister has done is really quite pathetic. The fact that the Prime Minister couldn't give a straight answer will send a real chill across Scotland's farming communities. The UK government led the betrayal of Scottish fishing, and now the Tories are planning to throw our farmers and crofters under their Brexit bus. This morning, Martin Kennedy, President of the National Farmers Union Scotland, told ITV that farmers will feel seriously betrayed by these proposals. This deal would be the final nail in the coffin for many Scottish crofters and farmers. It will end a way of life that has endured for generations, Prime Minister. I know that many of the Prime Minister's Tory colleagues privately agree with me and want him to pull back from this deal. So will the Prime Minister finally listen, think again, and ditch a deal that will send our farmers down under?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I really think, well, first of all, he's totally wrong about what he says about the fisheries, because, in fact, there are massive opportunities for fisheries for the whole of the UK as we take back control of our territorial waters. And that will be the same for Scotland and around the UK. And I think, again, he is grossly underestimating the ability of the people of this country, the agricultural communities of this country, the farming industry, to make the most of free trade. This is a country that grew successful and prosperous on free trade, on exporting around the world. Our food exports are second to none, Mr. Speaker. He should be proud of that. He should be celebrating that. And all he does, Mr. Speaker, is call for us to put up the drawbridge and go back into the EU to be run by Brussels. That's his manifesto, and I think the people of this country have decisively rejected it.
Jo Gideon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. North Staff's YMCA in my constituency undertakes fantastic work transforming the lives of young people locally in the Stoke-on-Trent community, and I'm delighted that they have been recognised for their work through the Queen's Award for Enterprise. There is no better example of levelling up in action, and I would like to invite the Prime Minister to join me in congratulating all the staff, volunteers and partners of the YMCA in North Staffordshire, and I look forward to showing him levelling up in action when he next visits Stoke-on-Trent, the new second home of the Home Office.
Prime Minister.
I thank my honourable friend very much, and she's totally right, and it's part of our levelling up. We're absolutely determined to do this as fast as we possibly can. I thank you for my honourable friend's message about it this morning. We are sending not just back offices, Mr. Speaker, but some of the most important departments of state will be run from around our great cities and towns in the whole of the UK, and I believe that will have a dramatic effect on levelling up across the UK, and I'm thankful to her for her question.
Ed Davey. Mr. Speaker, local planning reforms introduced by Liberal Democrat ministers have seen communities across England vote for new developments, including new housing, new affordable housing, new community facilities, whilst also protecting the environment of the countryside. So why is the Prime Minister so determined to push through his planning reforms that will do nothing to solve the country's real housing crisis, will allow developers to ride roughshod over local communities, and will mean, in the words of his immediate predecessor as Prime Ministers, the wrong homes being built in the wrong places?
Mr. Speaker, he's completely wrong, and he should look at the bill when it comes forward, because we want to protect the green belt, we want to protect our wonderful open spaces. This is a government that understands the value of the countryside and rural Britain, but we also think that young people have been deprived for too long of the ability to get onto the housing ladder, Mr. Speaker, and it's not just in the South East, it's across the country, and that's why we're bringing forward sensible reforms to allow brownfield sites to go ahead.
Andrew Buffer.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. 2 weeks ago, in giving the Scottish Conservatives their highest ever number of votes in the era of devolution, the Scottish people decided that Scotland would remain at the heart of this newly reinvigorated global Britain. So with that in mind, would the Prime Minister accept my invitation to Stonehaven in my constituency to come and plant one of 120 cherry blossom trees donated by the Sakura Cherry Blossom Tree Trust to celebrate the deep and growing links between our country and that other great trading nation, Japan?
Prime Minister.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, and I think that such a gesture would be the cherry on the cake of the free trade deal that we've already done.
Howell Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In 2019, before visiting Wales, the Prime Minister said, "I will always back Britain's great farmers." Now it looks as if he's backing Australia's farmers instead. So will he today keep to his word, really back Welsh farmers and permanently rule out tariff-free access for Australian lamb and beef imports?
Mr. Speaker, I will back Britain's farmers and Welsh farmers in exporting their fantastic lamb around the world. Mr. Speaker, is it not a disgrace that not a single morsel of Welsh lamb has so passed the lips of the Americans in the last 20 years or more, Mr. Speaker? What about China, Mr. Speaker? Has he no ambition for the people of this country or for the people of Wales or for Welsh farmers? I do. This government does, Mr. Speaker. That's why we're getting on with our agenda.
Virginia Cross.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Prime Minister or Prif Weinidog agree with me that a free port on Anglesey would create much-needed skilled jobs and investment, protect our precious Welsh language and culture, and breathe fire into the nostrils of the Welsh dragon? And will the Prime Minister accept an invitation on behalf of the people of Ynys Môn to join me on a tour of the island to include a panad at the Truck Stop Cafe in Holyhead?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, it says here that I mustn't express a preference on the location of free ports, and I won't. But she makes an outstanding case as ever. She is together with our Welsh colleagues, Welsh Conservative colleagues. I believe she's helping now to apply the Vicks inhaler to the bunged-up nostrils of the Welsh dragon.
Richard Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Despite the opprobrium which the Prime Minister always seems to seek to heap upon the Scottish National Party, at the Scottish elections 2 weeks ago, the SNP was returned to government with twice the number of MSPs as their nearest rivals in the Scottish Conservatives, securing 48% of the vote, 49% of the seats in the proportional system, and with 51% of voters backing parties which support an independence referendum in the current term. So if the Prime Minister genuinely believes that his criticisms of the Scottish Government have any merit whatsoever, why does he consider that the Scottish National Party did so well in those elections, while his own party did so badly?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I totally reject what he's just said. I noticed that actually the Scottish National Party did less well than they did previously under Alex Salmond in 2011. I hesitate to point that out to the honourable member, but that is the reality, and I think the reason for that is that the people of Scotland, notwithstanding the nationalist approach that he takes, the people of Scotland have been very disappointed by the actual record of the Scottish Government in fighting crime, in improving education, and in making Scotland a great place to live and to invest. And that is the failing of which his government is being held to account.
Danny Kruger.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A large part of Salisbury Plain falls in my constituency of Devizes, and I therefore have the honour to represent a lot of serving soldiers and veterans and their families. So my right honourable friend will understand that feelings are running high in Wiltshire about the treatment of British Army veterans of the conflict in Northern Ireland. Can he assure me that legislation will be brought forward in this session to protect veterans from further prosecutions or investigations unless compelling new evidence is brought forward?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the House will have understood from my opening apology how difficult, how complex and how fraught these issues are. But we are committed to introduce legislation in this session to address the legacy of the Troubles in Northern Ireland and to introducing a fair package for veterans as well, and to protect them, as I've said many times before, from unfair, vexatious litigation when no new evidence has been brought forward.
Gerald Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There were no new measures in the Queen's speech to tackle youth unemployment. There are over 500,000 unemployed young people in this country, yet the government's flagship youth unemployment scheme is nowhere near sufficient, only helping around 1 in 25 young people. I and my honourable friend for Blaenau Gwent have already requested a meeting with the Minister to discuss local concerns from training providers and local businesses. So could I ask the Prime Minister what exactly he's going to do to address this and to safeguard the future of a generation of young people in this country?
We're putting very quickly, Mr. Speaker, we're putting £2 billion into the Kickstart programme for 18 to 24-year-olds and investing massively in the Restart programme for those who've been longer out of work. But can I also tell them that the businesses I talk to are currently facing shortages of workers in many, many sectors, and we will work flat out to ensure that we get those who want jobs to those who need workers as well.
James Coughlin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Prime Minister for the support he's already shown for
coming forward with an offshore transmission grid, which he knows will help us both to export our surplus offshore wind into the continent and reduce the infrastructure associated with new wind farm capacity. So it's very important to our communities. But there's a question over timing. So given that he's already set out a very ambitious and clear timetable to increasing offshore wind generation, will he now come out with an equally ambitious timetable for delivering an offshore grid?
Prime Minister. My honourable friend is spot on in what he says about the need for an offshore grid, as well as building the fantastic windmills. It's vital that we bring the energy onshore in a way that is has minimal disruption for local communities and enables us to maximise efficiency.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What does the Prime Minister think when he hears Jenny McGee, the nurse who saved his life, say of NHS staff, "We're not getting the respect and now pay that we deserve. I'm just sick of it, so I've handed in my resignation." Surely even he must pause and think what can be learned from the mistakes of the past year, what Jenny calls the indecisiveness and mixed messages of his government. And will he think again about giving nurses more than an insulting 1% pay rise?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, I think the whole House acknowledges our collective debt to the nurses of the NHS, and I certainly acknowledge my own huge personal debt. And that's why, of all the professions in this country, Mr. Speaker, in very, very tough times, we have asked the Public Sector Pay Review Board to look at an increase in pay for nurses. But in the meantime, we have increased starting salary for nurses by 12.8%. We have put in the bursary worth £5,000. We've restored that, Mr. Speaker, as well as £3,000 for extra help. But above all, Mr. Speaker, to all nurses, and I know what a tough year they have had. I know how hard it has been on the front line coping with this pandemic. We have done what I think is the most important thing of all, and that is to recruit many more nurses. There are now about 11,000 more nurses in the NHS today than there were this time last year, and there are 60,000 more, Mr. Speaker, in training, and we are on target to reach our target of 50,000 more nurses in the NHS.
To James Davies. Following on that theme, Mr. Speaker, patients in England have unfettered access to specialist hospital care anywhere in England, including within world-leading centres of excellence. But my constituents in North Wales have no such automatic choice, with access dependent on restrictive contracts or individual funding requests. So will my right honourable friend do all he can to ensure that healthcare features prominently within the UK Levelling Up agenda?
Prime Minister. Yes, I thank my honourable friend for his point, and he knows a great deal about the subject. We've worked very hard with the Welsh Government throughout the pandemic, supporting them with £8.6 billion of additional funding through the Barnett formula. But clearly we need to learn the lessons together as we bounce forward from this pandemic.
Justin Matters.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's now 664 days since the Prime Minister said he had a plan for social care. But the Department for Health and Social Care are advertising at the moment for social care policy advisors to, and I quote, develop proposals for reform. Why do that if there is a plan already? Every day more people lose their life savings to pay huge social care costs, and we can't even get a straight answer as to whether the government have a plan to fix social care. Never mind find out what it actually is. So just tell us, Prime Minister, do you have a plan, yes or no?
Mr. Speaker, yes is the answer, but I mean, the Labour Party junked it in 1990. This is something that for decades politicians have failed to address. 1999, Labour failed to address the plan. They had 13 years in government, Mr. Speaker. I think it was 13 unlucky years for this country. They didn't do it. And this government is going to tackle it. This government is going to finally address the issue of social care. And if they want to support it with their customary doughty resolve, Mr. Speaker, if they want to support it without wibble-wobbling from one week to the next in whatever their policy is, then without changing like weather vanes, which is what they normally do, if they want to support it, if they want to back it, then I'm all ears, Mr. Speaker.
Higginbotham. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Throughout this week, businesses across Burnley and Padiham have reopened their doors
to customers inside, from Usher and Molly Rigby's to Bellissimo and Real Cinema. Would the Prime Minister join with me in wishing them all the best of luck as they get back on their feet? And does he also agree with me that if we're to support local businesses in the long term, we need to create the environment and the opportunities they need to succeed, and that includes schemes like the Levelling Up Fund and the Lifetime Skills Guarantee?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, that's why we're investing, for instance, £3.6 million from the Getting Building Fund for the development of Pioneer Place. Burnley will also benefit from our High Streets Task Force. But what Burnley and towns across the country need more than anything else is passionate leadership, such as my honourable friend shows in championing their localities and getting the right investment in.
Final question, David Lind. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister will be aware of Gladys's proposal to close the McVitie's factory in Glasgow's East End, putting at risk up to 470 local jobs. So will the Prime Minister join with me in engaging with Gladys Global CEO Salman Amin and call upon him to rethink these plans, which would definitely unleash economic Armageddon on a very, very, very fragile part of the local economy?
Prime Minister.
Yes, I think McVitie's have been a proud part of the Scottish economy since 1800, and I know that people at the Tollcross factory, their relatives, will be very concerned about what's happening. I thank him for raising it. I know that conversations are now going on to see what we can do with, I think it's the Turkish company that now owns McVitie's. And I know my honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Scotland, is meeting the honourable member to discuss the situation.
I'm now suspending the House for 3 minutes to enable necessary arrangements for the next business.
That brings us to the end of this week's Prime Minister's Questions, the first session, actually, of PMQs since the recent elections. Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, opened up Prime Minister's Questions apologising for the Ballymurphy deaths, the British Army operation in 1971 that resulted in the deaths of innocent civilians after an inquest in Northern Ireland found the use of force had been unjustified. Now, the Prime Minister had been criticised for not coming immediately to the House and delivering a full statement, but today he has apologised. The government had already done so to the First and Deputy Minister. It's now time to welcome our guests for this part of the show. Caroline Dinenage, who is the Conservative MP and member of the government in the DCMS, a Culture Minister. Conor McGinn, a Shadow Security Minister for Labour, and the BBC's Deputy Political Editor, Vicki Young. Welcome to all of you. Now, Keir Starmer, unsurprisingly, the Labour leader, focused pretty well all his attention and questions on the issue over foreign travel and the introduction of this traffic light system. Vicki, broadly speaking, it is proving to be much more difficult to unlock in this regard than it is to place blanket restrictions.
Yeah, and I think that's been the case throughout the lockdowns that we've had, that although it's incredibly controversial and it's shocking bringing in these blanket bans on all sorts of things, actually, it's quite a simple message saying you can't go anywhere. What's happened now, as of yesterday, Monday actually, is that it's no longer illegal for people to leave the country. Now, you can do it, but the government is saying, actually, we would really generally prefer that you don't do it, particularly the amber countries. So just to recap, the green list countries, you can go on holiday. Not very many of them, it has to be said, Portugal being one of them. But the majority of the rest of the EU countries are on the amber list. And what the Prime Minister is saying very clearly is you can't go there on holiday. You can go there if it's an emergency or if it's a pressing visit to family or friends. Now, of course, that leaves open this whole point about you making the decision yourself. And that is what has changed here. The law is not stopping you doing it. But the guidance from the government is please don't go to these places on holiday, only go if you really have to. And their argument in Downing Street is that as we unlock, and they would say this is a cautious reopening, moving back to international travel, and don't forget, under huge pressure from the travel industry who don't want to lose another summer. They are desperately trying to encourage people to travel. They have decided to open this up, but they are clearly very worried about it.
Right. Caroline, would you agree that the characterisation and the communications programme from the government on this has been at least confusing, if not completely chaotic?
Well, It's a very difficult time, isn't it? We are going through this period of unlocking and beginning to sort of usher in this stage of personal responsibility rather than legal enforcement. So, of course, there's going to be a few bumps along the road. But you have to remember that, these steps are incredibly cautious still, and they've only been brought about because of just the incredible hard work and the progress that have been made by people across the UK. They aren't steps that are being replicated across the world everywhere, because not everyone's been able to have such a successful vaccine rollout, for example. Not everyone's been able to move forward in quite the same pace, but we're trying to do that. We're trying to usher in this new stage of personal responsibility, which is the right thing to do. We can't be telling everybody what to do forever. We can't be locking everybody down forever. We have to start moving forward.
Right. Conor, what exactly is Labour's policy when it comes to international travel?
Look, I think this is a complete mess, and we've had entirely conflicting and confusing messages.
I've done that, Conor, but I'm really keen to know what exactly, because there's been some confusion as to what Labour's policy is.
Well, there shouldn't be. A year ago, I challenged the Home Secretary directly on what our plans were for test and trace and why we had allowed 500,000 people to enter the country during the last lockdown. In February of this year, we called for and put to the vote in the House of Commons a call for a comprehensive quarantine system in hotels. Any reasonable person will look this week at what's happening in terms of 150 countries being on the amber list and thousands of people travelling to those, and wonder why, when we've had the optimism that's been created because of the successful vaccine programme, and this week we've seen pubs, libraries, restaurants, we've had spectators back at horse racing, at rugby league, in my own constituency in St Helens. Why would the government take this risk to open up the country to potential new variants? We've had the South African one, the Brazilian one, and now the Indian one. It's reckless and it's irresponsible.
Caroline?
Well, I think the Labour position is entirely inconsistent. I mean, if we're going back to last summer, Conor, last summer your Transport Secretary, the Shadow Transport Secretary, was calling for faster easing of the travel restrictions. Your leader, Keir Starmer, himself has said that quarantines are a blunt tool to deal with international travel. What we've been doing is moving forward very cautiously. Even now, even under the amber system, I mean, it's still a really complicated thing to be able to, an expensive thing to be able to go abroad and to come back. You have to have a test before you go, which you pay for. When you get back, you still have to quarantine, and then you have to take tests after the first couple of days, and then again after the 8th day. This is being checked up. Over 4.5 million checks and home visits by the police. So even now, with the measures being eased somewhat, it's still not the easiest thing in the world to pop overseas.
Caroline, what is the benefit or the purpose of this? We had 150 flights that left the UK yesterday to go to countries on the amber list. We've had differing messages from different government ministers. Why aren't we concentrating on opening up our own country and allowing people to see loved ones again? My children will see their grandparents who have been living in Wales and in Northern Ireland for the first time in nearly a year over the next number of weeks. That's what we should be focusing on. That's what people want us to do. It's an unnecessary risk that the government are taking, and we've rightly said that they shouldn't be doing it.
Right, are you confident, Caroline, bearing in mind you're the one who has just outlined about the potential impact when it comes to variants, and we heard the Prime Minister do the same during Prime Minister's questions. Do you think it was the right policy and is the right policy to be opening up at all when it comes to foreign travel?
I mean, the way Conor talks, it's as if it's either or, but actually there's both. From Monday, the restrictions here in domestically have eased significantly. I was able to hug my mum and dad.
Why have you had to relax? Why have you had to relax the restrictions and guidelines on foreign travel?
Well, if you look at, for the amber guidance, if you look at it, it is really only for essential travel only, and it's very much for compassionate reasons. Really, it's for people to attend funerals and for really kind of urgent compassionate care needs as a number one reason. So it's not a willy-nilly for everyone to pack their bags and get overseas as quickly as they can. It's not that at all. It is very clearly for essential travel. But as I say, it is ushering in this new era of putting people's responsibility in their own hands, and I think that's really important. We do need to need to gradually move back into that world. We can't live in a lockdown state forever.
Isn't that true, Connor? I mean, that's the point. This is about managing risks, that the country can't stay in lockdown forever. And is Labour's policy then to pause all international travel?
Look, that's what we've called for, a comprehensive hotel quarantine system. We did it 2 months ago. And of course, this is about risk. And of course, it's hugely difficult for the government. And I don't envy their task. And we have tried where possible over the last year to be as supportive as we can, and inevitably mistakes will be made. But this just seems unnecessary and it seems reckless. In the week when we're opening up the country, when there's a huge sense of optimism, when we are having to be careful and advising people not to hug each other too closely, it just seems bizarre that we would then open up to international travel, these amber list countries with mixed messages from the government, and 150 flights.
OK,
yesterday.
So just to be clear, you'd like all those amber list countries to be on a red list and you want to pause international travel completely?
No, I think what we need is clarity from the government about what being on the amber list means. The Prime Minister moved further towards that today, but what we've had is ministers saying you can use it to visit friends. The term compassionate is a very wide one. We need to be clear about what this travel is for, and we need in place a comprehensive hotel quarantine system. Only 3 out of every 100 entries and re-entries into the UK were subject to test and trace during the previous lockdowns. We need to fix that, and we need a comprehensive system.
I'm going to bring Vicki in, but just before we move on, Connor, should any flights going to amber countries be taking off?
Well, clearly there are compassionate grounds and very limited where people can travel and are subject to very stringent rules. But that is not what is happening. Clearly, the government needs to send a message on this so people know what the rules are and what rules they should follow. I agree with Caroline that people should take personal responsibility, but it's very difficult to ask people to be responsible for the choices they make when they're receiving conflicting advice about what those choices should be.
Vicki?
Caroline, could I ask you about people who have had both vaccinations? Because we're going to be in a situation quite soon where lots of EU countries are saying that British people in that position can travel to their countries and not have to face testing or quarantine. And yet in this country, those people are being treated the same as everybody else. Do you think there's going to come a moment where the government reluctantly is going to have to say, we are going to have to treat people differently, and those who have got the protection of double vaccination can maybe have more freedoms than others?
Well, I mean, I don't think the government ever wants to create any kind of two-tier system because, you know, that there's a whole range of people who...
Even though that's what EU countries will be doing.
Well, you know, and this is always going to be an evolving situation. We are and we have been for the last 15 months in uncharted territory. We have to navigate our way through this in the very best way we possibly can. We need to get to a position where people are able to calculate and manage risk for themselves. And, you know, and that's what this gradual unlocking and easing of restrictions will do. But, you know, I don't believe that Conor is right. I think that we have set out very clearly what the kind of rules and guidelines are around international travel. And, you know, we really want to work to a position where people can travel more freely in the future. But that's only going to happen if people kind of, you know, stick to the amazing work that's been happening so far, you know, all the vaccine take up and all the, you know, really, really hard work that people have put into just keeping everyone safe.
Right. Well, let's talk about a country that is actually on the red list, and that is India. I mean, can you tell our viewers, Caroline, as a member of the government, how many planes are currently arriving in the UK from India, whether that's a daily figure, a weekly figure or a monthly figure?
I don't know how many planes are arriving from India, but I do know that we have some of the most stringent border measures in the world. As you know, India are on one of the red list
I do, but should there be planes arriving there at all? People may be astonished to know that despite the fears and concerns around the India variant, as it is called, rightly or wrongly, with surge testing and vaccinations encouraged in parts of the country here, that there are still planes arriving, even if you don't know the number.
But you still have British nationals that need to get back from India, and regardless of whether they have homes here or not, people who do need to come here for you know, the very, very, very narrow list of reasons that that they may have to come, do still have to go into a hotel and quarantine for the 10-day period. So, you know, it's not that people are coming here on planes and then are able to just sort of, you know, disappear into the population.
Right. I mean, according to the reports, there do seem to be rather a lot of planes. Admittedly, we can't completely verify it, but just to give you an example, LBC Radio reporting 110 planes have arrived in the last 4 weeks or so. The Mirror newspaper is reporting that 3 planes arrived at Heathrow in a single morning. It looks like that was yesterday. But, Conor, on the basis of what Caroline has just said, do you accept there do need to be some planes? There does need to be some travel, essentially, for people coming to and from India?
Of course, there will always be essential travel that is required, and there is a need to bring British nationals home, and we've seen that over the last number of weeks. But what we've also seen is this confused and mixed messaging from the government and a lack of clarity about what the rules are in terms of leaving and re-entering the UK, but also about the measures that should be taken when...
Sorry, what's the confusion around leaving the UK if you have to travel to India?
Well, the government hasn't been clear that those are the only reasons and set out the limitations upon which you can travel.
Well, a red list country, I think it is quite clear why and how you can actually leave the country to go to somewhere like India.
Look, I think what needs to be clarified from the government is in terms of the arrivals that we have in from India and what the measures are around quarantine. And we also need proper test and trace, and we also need to know how these are being enforced. We've seen chaos at the border on arrivals that have been entering the UK, and we have seen a lack of any follow-up. I think that's evidenced by the fact we had 500,000 people who entered the country during the last lockdown. It's been too little and too late. And as I say, I acknowledge the fact that these are difficult decisions and there's always an element of managing and mitigating risk. But I think what we've seen this week is a sense of optimism that there was initially about our own country opening up, about people being able to take that responsibility and move freely around their own communities and their own places. That has been tempered and in fact hampered somewhat by the anxiety that now exists about the India variant and the fact that people feel that the borders haven't been properly secured.
Well, on that, Caroline, why wasn't India added to the red list at the start of April when Pakistan and Bangladesh were put on it? India was added to the red list on the 23rd of April, but Pakistan and Bangladesh had been on it since the 9th.
Well, I mean, we took the precautionary action to ban travel from India on the 23rd of April, and that was actually 6 days before this variant was put under a kind of investigation and a full 2 weeks before it was labelled as a variant of concern. Now, that's important because this viruses mutate and new variants will spring up all the time. You can't just, put a country on a red list or shut your borders just because of a new variant. You have to, have some sort of indication that that variant is worrying, is going to transmit more, is going to be more of an issue for your population. And, so we did act as soon as we saw that this, the fact before we knew that this was going to be a variant of concern. I don't think these allegations are fair.
All right. I mean, Vicki, just before we leave this discussion around travel, Boris Johnson has said there will be some more data around the transmissibility of the India variant. But at the moment, he is keeping to the unlocking roadmap, even though there has been some question mark around the 21st of June.
Yeah, I mean, I think they simply don't know is the truth of it. And we are several weeks away from when that decision needs to be made. Now, I think it was very interesting, and it's a point that is slightly being missed in all of this, which he reiterated today, is that the early indications are that the vaccine is working, and that ultimately is the most important thing here. And what they're unsure about is the transmissibility, about how much and how quickly that might be spreading. So that's the data that they don't have at the moment. What they're doing is they're looking at the people that came in from India, who they've passed it to, and whether they've passed it to their own family groups, if you like. And that's why it looks like it's transmitting so rapidly and to more people. What they're not sure about yet is whether it is transmitting more quickly in the community. But ultimately, the vaccines seem to be working, and he chose to give us that new data, which they're looking at every single day. There's more and more information coming in every single day. That's what they'll be most keen to look at, because if you break the link between the number of cases and the hospitalisations, it doesn't matter as much. And I'm not saying it doesn't matter at all. Of course, more cases lead to all sorts of other problems. But if people aren't going into hospital because of it, that also obviously is a major plus point.
All right, Caroline, you're a culture minister. Your boss wrote this piece in the Sunday Telegraph, Oliver Dowden. He said red wall voters to replace metropolitan bubbles on heritage boards. Pledges. Oliver Dowden, Culture Secretary, says move will stop boards bowing to pressure from woke activists over contested history. What evidence is there, Caroline, that public appointments to arts bodies skews towards people who live in London?
Well, the evidence that 50% of trustees and board members live in London, so and only 15% of the population live in London. So, my boss Oliver Dowden is quite right in saying that if we're serious about levelling up across the country, we need to make sure that these great British institutions that may be based in London, like the British.
Caroline. We seem to have lost you. I don't know if you have just dropped out or whether you've accidentally muted yourself. We'll come back to you in just a moment. Connor, on that, she's right, isn't she, Caroline? Because almost half of the newly appointed chairs to publicly funded institutions last year lived in London, according to the Commissioner for Public Appointments annual report for 2019-20. So there is an issue.
I think this debate is a load of patronising old guff, to tell you the truth. I mean, in the northwest of England alone, we've got the People's History Museum, the Imperial War Museum in Manchester, we've got the Maritime Museum, the International Slavery Museum in Liverpool, both of them a half an hour from my front door. This idea that culture is somehow the preserve of London, this false binary as well that sets the rest of the country against London. And I know it's not just the government that does that. I know it's sometimes an easy attack for some of my own colleagues to make. I just think the public are not interested in it. Culture is not something that needs to be imposed on any of our communities in the north. We have our own. They're situated in towns and cities right across the north of England. Of course, it's good to have diversity on boards in terms of gender, in terms of race, in terms of class as well, and that's important. But to frame this as the culture secretary, who's actually not a bad fella, so I was quite surprised that he has taken this tone, but to frame this in the context of this culture war, I think is really damaging. History belongs to everybody. The great thing about museums is you visit them, you see what's there, you read the story, and you make your own mind up about these things.
Right.
People aren't stupid.
Right, a patronising load of guff, even if Oliver Dowden's not a bad fellow. Caroline.
I disagree so much. I think it's absolutely vital that we attract people from outside of the metropolitan bubble to run these great British institutions. You know, these big national galleries and libraries are not just for people in London; they're for people across the whole UK. This is our history, our heritage.
Caroline, I don't need to go to London to go to art galleries or museums or the theatre. We've got them in the north of England. You know,
wouldn't you want your constituents? Don't you want your constituents to be represented on? I've been speaking. I'm a former Minister for Women and Equalities and a former Minister for Disability in the Department for Health and Social Care, and I'm really passionate about making sure that we increase representation across all groups on our boards of all types of government boards, because companies and boards work better when they more closely represent the people out there.
Go on,
why frame it in the context of being against something, against people? You know, this idea of the metropolitan bubble. Like, what is the metropolitan bubble? What is it you're talking about? Like, spell it out. You know what I mean? Who are the people that you're going to put on these boards? You know, are they political appointments? Do they have to have a certain ideology or a view of history, or are they going to be genuinely representative? It just seems to me to be a political crusade and something that the government sees as expedient to set people against each other. And and I'm all for, widening access, inclusion and diversity, and making sure that these institutions, people are able to travel to them, to visit them, and to shape them and the story that they tell. But I just think to frame it like this, it's really transparent, Caroline. And as I said, like the DCMS ministers, I think have done really good stuff over the last year, hugely supportive of sport, and hospitality and leisure and all of that. And I just sort of feel Oliver let himself down a wee bit on this one.
Caroline?
No, I feel that's so wrong. I just feel it's so important. For so long, a lot of these big institutions have really only attracted applications from metropolitan areas. And I just want to feel that people up and down the country that feel they've got something to give to the way these places are run to make them appeal to a wider audience are able to apply for these roles. So I've been speaking to groups like, the Northern Power Women organisation, which is just the most brilliant group of businesswomen in the north, to encourage people like that when vacancies arrive to apply for them, to see themselves in these roles. I just think that's what levelling up is all about, is getting the views of people right across the country. It's so important.
Right, well, let's, on that levelling up point, I'm just going to show our viewers, guests, the Times story. Hundreds of Home Office civil servants face being moved to Stoke under levelling up programme. This is part of a wider move, isn't it, by the government?
I love the way that's framed, face being moved to Stoke, as if it's some kind of terrible thing. Yeah, there's a move to move civil servants out of London, certainly, and the Department of Business has announced today that they too are going to move civil servants out and about. But it's not just about Northern England, actually. It's also about this agenda about the union, because a lot of the people from the business department will be going to Wales and Scotland too. So I think it is trying to, broaden the kind of people that get recruited ultimately, rather than moving people from London to places. It's recruiting locally is going to be the ambition.
I mean, do you back this kind of thing, Connor? Is this what levelling up means to you?
I think if it's followed through with substance, I think, again, the terms, and I said this in a debate in the House of Commons last week, I think they pass people by, these terms, and sometimes the debate we have in Westminster isn't reflective of what people's concerns are. Look, I would welcome any investment in St Helens. We want civil servants to come, we want businesses to move there. So I think if it's backed up by real, tangible devolution of power to these places, as well as ensuring that you don't have to leave towns and cities outside of London to have a good career in business and the public sector, then yes, it's a good thing, but it needs to be backed up.
All right, backed up by substance. That's all we've got time for. Sorry, Caroline, we couldn't get back to you, but thank you for being our guest, and to you, Vicki. I'll be back tomorrow.